Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent weekends at the mall or watching movies, she was out on her family's ranch, learning to shoot with her grandfather's old hunting rifle. Her grandfather, a Korean War veteran, had taught her that shooting wasn't just about pulling a trigger. It was about discipline, breathing, focus, and respect for the weapon. When Sarah decided to join the Army at 18, her family wasn't surprised. What did surprise them was when she chose to become a drill sergeant after completing her initial training and deployment overseas. Most people assumed she'd go into intelligence or communications, jobs they thought were more suitable for women. But Sarah had other plans. Fort Benning was where dreams were either made or broken. The sprawling military base in Georgia was home to some of the toughest training programs in the U.S. Army. When Sarah arrived as a newly appointed drill sergeant, she knew she'd face challenges that had nothing to do with the recruits she'd be training. The other drill sergeants were all men, most with years of experience and strong opinions about women in leadership roles. Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson was the most vocal of her critics. A 15-year veteran with biceps like tree trunks and a voice that could shatter glass, Thompson had been the top drill sergeant at the base for 3 consecutive years. He made it clear from day one that he didn't think Sarah belonged there. "This isn't a place for playing house," Martinez, he'd say loud enough for others to hear. "These boys need real soldiers training them, not some girl who thinks she could do a man's job." Sarah never responded to his comments directly. She'd learned early in her military career that action spoke louder than words, and she was determined to prove herself through performance, not arguments. She studied harder than anyone else, memorized every regulation, and pushed herself to be physically stronger than she'd ever been. The base had several training companies, each responsible for turning civilian recruits into soldiers over a grueling 16-week period. Sarah was assigned to Delta Company, which had traditionally been one of the lower-performing units. The previous drill sergeant had been reassigned after a series of training accidents and discipline problems. Her first morning addressing her new recruits, Sarah stood before 60 young men and women from all walks of life. Some were barely 18, fresh out of high school. Others were older, looking for a second chance or a new direction in life. All of them looked nervous, excited, and completely unprepared for what lay ahead. "Listen up," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the formation. "I'm Drill Sergeant Martinez. For the next 16 weeks, your success is my responsibility, and my success depends on your willingness to push beyond what you think you're capable of. I don't care where you came from or what you did before you got here. What matters is what you do from this moment forward." She could see some of the male recruits exchanging glances, probably wondering if a female drill sergeant would be tough enough. Sarah had dealt with these doubts before, and she knew the only way to overcome them was through consistent, unwavering leadership. The first few weeks were challenging in ways Sarah hadn't fully anticipated. While she had no trouble with the physical demands or the knowledge requirements of her job, she constantly felt the weight of proving herself to her fellow drill sergeants, her superiors, and even some of her own recruits. Thompson seemed to take particular pleasure in pointing out any small mistake or oversight. When one of Sarah's recruits failed a uniform inspection, Thompson was quick to suggest that maybe women weren't detail-oriented enough for military standards. When another recruit struggled with physical training, Thompson wondered aloud if female drill sergeants were too soft to push soldiers to their limits. But Sarah's recruits began to notice something different about their drill sergeant. She wasn't trying to intimidate them or break them down just to build them back up. Instead, she focused on understanding each person's strengths and weaknesses, then developing training strategies that helped everyone improve. Private Johnson, a quiet kid from rural Alabama, struggled with the academic portions of training. Sarah spent extra time with him after regular training hours, helping him develop study strategies and building his confidence. Private Rodriguez, a former gang member from Los Angeles, had anger management issues that threatened to get him discharged. Sarah worked with him on breathing techniques and conflict resolution, channeling his intensity into positive leadership skills. Word began to spread around the base about Delta Company's improvement. Their physical fitness scores were rising, their classroom performance was exceeding expectations, and their morale seemed higher than other companies. But Thompson and some of the other drill sergeants attributed this to Sarah being too easy on her recruits. She's not preparing them for real military life, Thompson complained to anyone who would listen. When these soldiers get to their permanent duty stations, they're going to get eaten alive because Martinez coddles them. The criticism bothered Sarah more than she let on, but she remained focused on her mission. She knew that every female leader who came after her would be judged, in part, by how she performed in this role. The pressure was enormous, but it also motivated her to excel in every aspect of her duties. As the weeks progressed, Sarah's recruits developed a fierce loyalty to their drill sergeant. They could see how hard she worked for them, how much she cared about their success, and how she never asked them to do anything she couldn't or wouldn't do herself. When they ran, she ran alongside them. When they did push-ups, she did more. When they stayed late to study, she was there to help. But the real test was still coming. Every company at Fort Benning had to complete a series of final evaluations that would determine their overall ranking and readiness for graduation. These evaluations included written exams, physical fitness tests, combat simulations, and weapons qualifications. The weapons qualification was particularly important because it tested one of the most fundamental soldier skills, the ability to accurately engage targets with an M4 rifle under pressure. Each recruit had to demonstrate proficiency at various distances and shooting positions, and the company's overall score would be based on everyone's performance. Sarah had always been an exceptional marksman, but she'd never had to prove it in front of the entire base leadership. The qualification would take place on the main firing range, with all the drill sergeants, company commanders, and even the base commanding officer in attendance. 2 days before the qualification, Thompson approached Sarah with a smug expression that made her immediately suspicious. "Martinez," he said, "I've been thinking about our little competition problem." Sarah had no idea what he was talking about, but she waited for him to continue. "See, I've been hearing all this talk about how great Delta Company is doing, how you're some kind of miracle worker. But I think it's time we settled this once and for all. I think we should have a little demonstration before the official qualification. Show these recruits what real marksmanship looks like." Sarah realized that Thompson was trying to set up some kind of public showdown. She could have declined, could have said it wasn't appropriate, could have pointed out that her job was to train soldiers, not engage in ego contests with other drill sergeants. Instead, she looked Thompson in the eye and said, "What did you have in mind?" Thompson's grin widened as he outlined his plan. He wanted to organize an unofficial shooting competition between drill sergeants, right before the official company qualifications began. All the recruits would watch, along with the base leadership, and it would serve as a demonstration of proper marksmanship techniques. "We'll each take 10 shots at targets from 300 meters, Thompson explained. "Standard M4 rifles, iron sights only. Winner gets bragging rights. And the losing drill sergeant has to admit in front of everyone that maybe they're not cut out for this job." Sarah knew this was a trap. Thompson was setting her up to fail publicly, hoping to undermine her credibility with her own recruits and prove his point about women not belonging in combat leadership roles. But she also knew that backing down would be worse than losing. Her recruits needed to see that she wouldn't be intimidated or bullied. "Fine," Sarah said simply. "When do we do this?" "Tomorrow morning, right before the company qualifications start. That'll give everyone a good warm-up show." Word spread quickly through the base about the impromptu competition. By the next morning, what was supposed to be a routine qualification day had turned into something resembling a sporting event. Recruits from all companies lined up behind the firing line to watch, and even off-duty soldiers showed up to see what everyone was talking about. Sarah arrived at the range early, as she always did, to check her equipment and run through her mental preparation routine. She'd brought her assigned M4 rifle, the same weapon she'd been using for training exercises. It wasn't the newest or most precise rifle on the base, but she was familiar with its quirks and had practiced with it extensively. Thompson arrived with his usual swagger, carrying a pristine M for that looked like it had just come out of the armory. He brought several other drill sergeants with him, all eager to watch what they expected would be Sarah's humiliation. Ready to learn something about real shooting, Martinez? Thompson called out loud enough for everyone to hear. Always ready to learn, Sarah replied calmly, focusing on her breathing and visualization exercises. The range officer called for everyone to take their positions. Standard procedure required shooters to verify their weapons were clear, load magazines with 10 rounds, and await the command to begin firing. Sarah went through the routine automatically, her hands steady despite the crowd watching every move. As she settled into her shooting position, Sarah noticed something that made her heart sink. Looking down at her rifle, she could see that the front sight post was severely damaged. Someone had deliberately bent it, making accurate shooting nearly impossible. The sight was so obviously sabotaged that she couldn't believe she'd missed it during her equipment check. Sarah's mind raced. She could call attention to the damage, but that would look like making excuses. She could request a different weapon, but the range officer had already called for shooters to take their positions. Any delay would disrupt the entire schedule and make her appear unprepared. Looking over at Thompson, she saw him watching her with obvious satisfaction. He knew exactly what had happened to her rifle, and he was waiting to see how she would react. For a moment, Sarah considered her options. She could go through with the shooting and almost certainly lose badly, giving Thompson the public victory he wanted. She could call attention to the sabotage and potentially create a bigger incident that might damage her career. Or she could find a third option. "Thompson," she called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've got a problem with my weapon. Mind if I borrow yours?" The request caught Thompson completely off guard. In military culture, asking to use someone else's personal weapon was unusual, but not unheard of in training situations. More importantly, Thompson couldn't refuse without looking petty in front of the entire base leadership. Sure," Thompson stammered, clearly not expecting this response. "But don't blame the weapon when you can't hit anything." Sarah walked over and took Thompson's pristine M4, while he picked up her damaged rifle. She could see the confusion on his face as he looked at the bent sight post, realizing that his sabotage plan had backfired spectacularly. Now Thompson was stuck with the damaged weapon he'd intended for Sarah, while she had his carefully maintained rifle. But Sarah knew that winning with a superior weapon wouldn't prove anything to the people who doubted her abilities. She needed to do something that would leave no room for excuses or explanations. "Actually," Sarah said, making a decision that surprised even herself, "let's make this more interesting. Instead of 10 shots each, how about we each take one shot? Single shot, 300 meters. Winner takes all." The crowd fell silent. Single-shot competitions were dramatically more difficult because there was no opportunity to adjust based on previous shots. One bullet, one chance to prove yourself. Thompson tried to hide his concern behind bluster. "Fine with me. But when you miss, I don't want to hear any complaints about the weapon or the wind or anything else." "No complaints," Sarah agreed. "But the same goes for you." The range officer confirmed that both shooters were ready and gave the command to load. Sarah inserted a single round into Thompson's rifle while he struggled with her damaged weapon. She could see him trying to compensate for the bent sight, but there was no reliable way to aim accurately with the damaged equipment. As she settled into her shooting position, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came over her during moments of intense focus. The crowd, the pressure, the politics, all of it faded away until there was nothing but her, the rifle, and the target 300 meters downrange. She controlled her breathing, aligned the sights, and began the slow, steady trigger pull that her grandfather had taught her 20 years earlier on the ranch in Texas. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the range. Thompson fired a moment later, his shot clearly pulled off target by the damaged sights. Everyone waited as the range officer used binoculars to examine the targets, then walked downrange to verify the results. The wait seemed to last forever, but Sarah felt confident about her shot. She'd felt the perfect trigger break and follow-through that indicated a well-placed round. When the range officer returned, he announced the results in a voice that carried clearly across the range. Thompson, no score. Martinez, dead center bullseye. The crowd erupted in cheers, particularly from Sarah's recruits who had watched their drill sergeant face down the base's most experienced marksman. But Sarah felt no satisfaction from Thompson's humiliation. Instead, she walked over to where he stood holding her damaged rifle. Sarah approached Thompson, who stood staring at the damaged rifle with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. The crowd was still buzzing about the shooting demonstration, but Sarah could see that Thompson was struggling with more than just losing the competition. "Thompson," she said quietly, so only he could hear, "we need to talk." She took him aside, away from the crowd and the other drill sergeants. Thompson's face was red, whether from anger or shame, Sarah couldn't tell. "I know you damaged my rifle," Sarah said simply, "and I know why you did it." Thompson started to protest, but Sarah held up her hand. "I'm not going to report it, and I'm not going to make a big deal about it. But I need you to understand something. This isn't about you versus me, or men versus women. This is about training the best soldiers we can and serving our country with honor." Thompson looked down at his boots, the fight seeming to go out of him. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under, Martinez. I've been the top drill sergeant here for 3 years. Everyone expects me to be the best at everything. Then you show up, and suddenly everyone's talking about Delta Company and how great you are." Sarah realized that Thompson's hostility wasn't just about gender. It was about fear. Fear of being replaced, fear of losing his identity as the base's premier drill sergeant, fear that his years of experience might not matter if someone else could get better results. "Thompson, there's room for both of us to be excellent at what we do. Your experience and knowledge are valuable. Instead of competing against each other, maybe we should be working together to make all our soldiers better." Before Thompson could respond, the range officer called for the official company qualifications to begin. Sarah had to return to her recruits, but she could see that her conversation with Thompson had given him something to think about. The official qualification went smoothly for Delta Company. Sarah's recruits had been well prepared, and their confidence was boosted by seeing their drill sergeant perform under pressure. One by one, they completed their shooting requirements with scores that exceeded the base average. But the real test came 2 weeks later when all the companies participated in a comprehensive field exercise. This was a multi-day event that tested everything the recruits had learned: combat tactics, physical endurance, teamwork, problem-solving, and leadership under stress. The exercise scenario involved a simulated peacekeeping mission in a hostile environment. Each company had to navigate through various challenges, including medical emergencies, equipment failures, enemy contact situations, and civilian evacuations. The companies would be scored on their ability to complete missions while maintaining unit cohesion and following proper procedures. Sarah spent days preparing her recruits for the exercise. She worked with them on communication protocols, decision-making under pressure, and adapting to unexpected situations. Most importantly, she emphasized that their success would depend on supporting each other and functioning as a team. "Remember," she told them during their final briefing, "the enemy you're facing isn't other companies or the evaluators. The real enemy is panic, confusion, and giving up when things get difficult. Trust your training, trust each other, and keep thinking even when everything seems to be falling apart." The exercise began before dawn on a Monday morning. Delta Company was assigned a series of objectives that would take them through swampland, urban terrain, and mountainous regions over 3 days. They had to carry all their equipment, maintain radio contact with headquarters, and complete specific missions at each location. The first day went well. Sarah's recruits demonstrated excellent teamwork and problem-solving abilities. When their radio equipment failed during a simulated enemy attack, they quickly established alternate communication methods. When one recruit was designated as wounded during a scenario, the others smoothly implemented casualty evacuation procedures they'd practiced dozens of times. But on the second day, everything started going wrong. It began with weather. A spring storm system moved through the area, bringing heavy rain, wind, and dropping temperatures. What had been challenging terrain became treacherous muddy slopes and swollen creek crossings. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the recruits struggled to navigate using only map and compass. Then came the equipment failures. Several backpacks developed tears in the rain, soaking vital supplies. 2 recruits developed severe blisters that made walking extremely painful. The water purification tablets turned out to be ineffective, forcing the company to boil all their drinking water and use precious fuel supplies. By the afternoon of the second day, Sarah could see that her recruits were reaching their breaking point. They were cold, wet, exhausted, and behind schedule on their mission objectives. Some were starting to argue with each other about navigation decisions and resource allocation. The unit cohesion she'd worked so hard to build was beginning to fracture under stress. This was exactly the kind of situation that separated successful companies from unsuccessful ones. Sarah knew that how she responded in the next few hours would determine whether her recruits completed the exercise with pride or limped to the finish line defeated. She called for a halt and gathered her recruits under the limited shelter of some pine trees. They sat in a circle, looking miserable and demoralized. Sarah could see doubt in their eyes, doubt about their abilities, doubt about whether they could complete the mission, and doubt about whether their drill sergeant could lead them through this crisis. "Listen to me," Sarah began, her voice cutting through the sound of rain on the trees. "I know this is harder than anything we've trained for. I know you're tired, cold, and frustrated. But I need you to remember why we're here." She paused, looking each recruit in the eye. "We're not here to prove we're the toughest, or the strongest, or the smartest. We're here to prove that when everything goes wrong, when a mission seems impossible, when every part of your body wants to quit, we're here to prove that we don't give up on each other." Private Johnson, the quiet kid from Alabama, raised his hand. "Drill Sergeant, what if we can't make it? What if we fail the exercise?" Sarah smiled for the first time in hours. "Johnson, the only way we fail is if we stop trying. The evaluators aren't looking for perfect performance under perfect conditions. They're looking for soldiers who can adapt, overcome, and keep fighting when everything falls apart." She stood up and shouldered her pack. "Right now, there are 4 other companies out here facing the same weather, the same equipment failures, and the same challenges we're facing. The difference is going to be which company remembers their training and which company gives up when things get hard." Private Rodriguez, the former gang member from Los Angeles, stood up next. "What are our orders, Drill Sergeant?" "Our orders are simple," Sarah replied. "We're going to complete this mission. We're going to take care of each other. And we're going to show everyone what Delta Company is made of." One by one, the other recruits stood up and prepared to continue the exercise. Sarah could see that their confidence was returning, not because the situation had improved, but because they remembered they were part of something bigger than their individual discomfort. What happened over the next 18 hours would become legendary at Fort Benning, talked about for years as an example of leadership under impossible conditions. The rain continued throughout the night, turning their planned route into a nightmare of slippery rocks and rushing water. Sarah led her company through terrain that would have been challenging in daylight and good weather, but in the dark and storm, it was genuinely dangerous. When they reached what should have been a simple creek crossing, they found a raging torrent that was completely impassable at the designated location. Sarah could have radioed for guidance or requested a route change, but she knew that would cost precious time and points in their evaluation. Instead, she sent scouts up and down the creek to find an alternative crossing point. Private Chun, a recruit from California who had grown up camping with her family, found a spot about half a mile upstream where fallen trees had created a natural bridge. The crossing was risky. The logs were wet and slippery, and the water below was deep and fast-moving. But Sarah tested the route first, then had her recruits cross one at a time while others secured safety lines. It took 2 hours to get everyone across safely, but they did it without losing equipment or injuring anyone. By morning, They had made up the time lost during the creek crossing and were back on schedule for their next objective. But the real test came when they reached the urban warfare simulation site. The scenario involved clearing a mock village where enemy forces were holding civilian hostages. Delta Company had to work with simulated local police, coordinate with other military units, and neutralize threats without harming innocent people. It was one of the most complex exercises in the entire training program. As they approached the village, Sarah noticed that something was different. There were more evaluators present than usual, and she recognized several senior officers from base headquarters who normally wouldn't attend routine training exercises. Word about the shooting competition and Delta Company's performance had apparently reached the highest levels of command. The pressure was enormous, but Sarah reminded herself and her recruits to focus on their training and trust in their preparation. They had practiced urban warfare scenarios dozens of times, and she was confident in their abilities. The exercise began with Sarah's company receiving a mission briefing from the simulated local commander. Intelligence reports indicated that a terrorist cell was holding 6 civilian hostages in a residential compound. Delta Company's mission was to provide security and support while Special Operations Forces conducted the actual rescue. But as they moved into position, the scenario changed dramatically. The exercise controllers announced that the Special Operations team had been delayed and would not arrive for several hours. Meanwhile, intelligence indicated that the terrorists were planning to execute the hostages if their demands were not met within the next 2 hours. Sarah was faced with an impossible decision. Standard procedure called for waiting for specialized rescue forces, but the scenario created a situation where following standard procedure would result in simulated civilian deaths. She had to decide whether to risk her entire company on a rescue mission they weren't specifically trained for, or follow protocol, and accept the loss of innocent lives. She gathered her squad leaders for a quick conference. These were the recruits who had shown the most leadership potential throughout training. Soldiers like Private Rodriguez, who had learned to channel his intensity into positive leadership, and Private Johnson, whose quiet determination had earned the respect of his peers. "What do you think?" Sarah asked them. "Do we wait for backup and risk the hostages, or do we improvise a rescue mission?" Private Martinez, a recruit from New Mexico who had joined the Army to pay for college, spoke first. "Drill Sergeant, if these were real hostages, we wouldn't hesitate. We've trained for this kind of situation, even if it wasn't exactly what we expected." Private Williams, a recruit from Detroit who had overcome significant personal challenges to make it through training, nodded in agreement. "Our job is to protect people who can't protect themselves. That doesn't change just because the situation isn't perfect." Sarah felt a surge of pride as she listened to her recruits reason through the problem. They weren't just following orders or trying to give her the answer they thought she wanted to hear. They were thinking like soldiers, weighing risks and responsibilities and making decisions based on their values and training. "All right," Sarah decided. "We're going to attempt the rescue, but we're going to do it smart, and we're going to do it together." She quickly developed a plan that utilized every skill her recruits had learned during training. The company would divide into 3 teams, one to provide overwatch and security, one to create a diversion, and one to conduct the actual rescue. Each team had specific objectives and backup plans if things went wrong. What made the plan particularly bold was that Sarah assigned herself to the rescue team rather than staying in a command position. Some of the evaluators later said this was either brilliant leadership or dangerous showboating, but Sarah knew her recruits needed to see her sharing the same risk she was asking them to take. The rescue operation began with the diversion team creating a distraction on the opposite side of the compound. Using smoke, grenades, and carefully coordinated movement, they convinced the simulated terrorists that the main assault was coming from that direction. Meanwhile, the rescue team moved into position on the building's blind side. Sarah had studied the structure during their approach and identified a second-floor window that appeared to provide access to the room where the hostages were being held. Private Chun, the recruit who had found the creek crossing, volunteered to scale the building's exterior wall and secure the entry point. Her civilian camping experience had included rock climbing, and she was the most qualified person for the job. As Chun climbed toward the window, Sarah and the rest of the rescue team waited in tense silence. They could hear the diversion team maintaining their noisy demonstration on the far side of the building, keeping the enemy's attention focused away from the actual rescue. Chun reached the window and signaled that she had visual contact with the simulated hostages. According to her report, there were 2 enemy guards in the room, both facing away from the window. The hostages appeared to be unharmed, but were secured with restraints that would take time to remove. Sarah made the final decision to proceed with the rescue. Using hand signals, she coordinated the entry with precision timing that would have impressed special operations professionals. Chun entered through the window at the exact moment that Sarah's team breached the main door, overwhelming the defenders before they could react. Within 90 seconds, all simulated hostages were secured and the enemy forces were neutralized. Delta Company had successfully completed one of the most challenging scenarios in the entire training program, using improvised tactics and demonstrating the kind of initiative that separated exceptional soldiers from ordinary ones. But the exercise wasn't over yet. As they prepared to evacuate the hostages, new intelligence arrived indicating that additional enemy forces were approaching the village. Delta Company now had to conduct a fighting withdrawal while protecting 6 civilian evacuees and maintaining unit cohesion. This was where all their training in teamwork and communication became critical. Sarah's recruits demonstrated the discipline and coordination they had developed over months of preparation, covering each other's movements and adapting to changing situations without losing focus on their primary mission. They successfully extracted all personnel and reached the designated evacuation point with time to spare. As they secured the area and awaited final evaluation, Sarah looked at her exhausted but triumphant recruits and realized that something significant had changed during the exercise. These young people were no longer the uncertain civilians who had arrived at Fort Benning 16 weeks earlier. They had become soldiers in the truest sense, not because they could march in formation or recite regulations, but because they had learned to think, adapt, and sacrifice for something larger than themselves. The formal evaluation results were announced 3 days later in the base's main auditorium. Representatives from all 5 training companies sat with their drill sergeants, waiting to hear how they had performed during the comprehensive field exercise. The atmosphere was tense, as these scores would determine which recruits graduated with honors and which companies would be recognized for excellence. Colonel Martinez, the base commanding officer, took the podium to announce the results. Sarah noticed that he seemed to be looking directly at Delta Company as he began his remarks. This training cycle has been remarkable in many ways, Colonel Martinez began. We've seen exceptional individual performances, outstanding teamwork, and leadership that reflects the very best traditions of the United States Army. He paused and looked out over the assembled recruits and drill sergeants. The field exercise results were particularly impressive this year. All 5 companies faced identical challenges, but their responses varied dramatically. Some companies followed standard procedures and achieved acceptable results. Others adapted to circumstances and exceeded expectations. Sarah could feel her heart racing as the colonel continued. One company stood out not just for their final scores, but for the way they approached every challenge. When equipment failed, they improvised solutions. When weather made their mission more difficult, they supported each other and pressed forward. When they faced an impossible decision, they chose to risk everything to protect innocent lives. Colonel Martinez looked directly at Sarah and her recruits. Delta Company achieved the highest overall scores in every category of evaluation. More importantly, they demonstrated the kind of leadership, initiative, and moral courage that we hope to develop in every soldier who graduates from this installation. The auditorium erupted in applause, with Sarah's recruits cheering and embracing each other. But Sarah found herself looking over at Thompson, who was sitting with his own company. To her surprise, Thompson was also applauding, and When their eyes met, he nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect. Later, as the ceremony concluded and families began congratulating the graduating recruits, Thompson approached Sarah. "Martinez," he said, extending his hand. "I owe you an apology." "Several apologies, actually." Sarah shook his hand, noting that his grip was firm but not aggressive. "I was wrong about a lot of things," Thompson continued. "I thought having a female drill sergeant would make the base look soft, or that you couldn't handle the pressure of training soldiers. I thought you were getting special treatment, or that your success was just luck." He paused, looking uncomfortable but determined to continue. "But watching your recruits during that field exercise, seeing how they responded to pressure, and how they trusted your leadership even in impossible situations, that's not luck. That's the result of exceptional training and genuine leadership." Sarah appreciated Thompson's words, but she was more interested in looking toward the future than rehashing past conflicts. "Thompson, your experience and knowledge are valuable to this base and to the Army. Instead of competing against each other, what if we work together to share best practices and improve training for all companies?" Over the following months, Sarah and Thompson developed a collaborative relationship that benefited both their companies. Thompson's expertise in physical conditioning and military traditions complemented Sarah's focus on problem-solving and adaptive leadership. They began conducting joint training exercises and sharing techniques that had proven successful. The success of Delta Company also had broader implications. Word of their performance spread throughout the Army's training community, and Sarah began receiving requests to speak at leadership conferences and contribute to training doctrine development. 6 months after graduation, Sarah received letters from several of her former recruits who had been assigned to various units around the world. Their reports were consistently positive. They were performing well in their permanent assignments, taking on leadership responsibilities, and applying the problem-solving skills they had learned during basic training. Private Johnson, the quiet recruit from Alabama, had been selected for advanced training as a communications specialist. Private Rodriguez had been chosen for leadership development programs and was already being considered for promotion ahead of his peers. Private Chun had been assigned to a mountain warfare unit where her climbing skills and adaptability were proving invaluable. But the letter that meant the most to Sarah came from Private Williams, the recruit from Detroit who had overcome significant personal challenges to complete training. "Drill Sergeant Martinez," Williams wrote, "I wanted you to know that everything you taught us about not giving up when things get difficult has made all the difference in my Army career. But more than that, it's changed how I approach every challenge in my life. You showed us that real strength isn't about being the loudest or the most intimidating. It's about being willing to stand up for what's right and help others succeed." A year after the shooting incident that had started everything, Sarah was promoted to the rank of first sergeant and given responsibility for overseeing multiple training companies. In her new role, she implemented programs that emphasized adaptive leadership, ethical decision-making, and collaborative problem-solving. The shooting competition that Thompson had intended as a humiliation had become the foundation for a new approach to military training that focused on developing thinking soldiers rather than just obedient ones. During her promotion ceremony, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about her grandfather, who had taught her that shooting was about more than just marksmanship. It was about discipline, focus, and respect. She thought about the recruits who had trusted her leadership even when the path ahead was uncertain. Most of all, she thought about the lesson that had emerged from that day on the firing range. That real leadership isn't about proving you're better than others, but about helping others discover they're capable of more than they imagined. Years later, when young drill sergeants asked Sarah about the secret to her success, she would tell them about the day her rifle was sabotaged and she had to use her competitor's weapon to prove herself. "The most important thing I learned," she would say, "is that it doesn't matter what obstacles people put in your way. What matters is how you respond to those obstacles and what you do with the opportunities that come from overcoming them." Sarah Martinez had started her career trying to prove that a woman could be as good a drill sergeant as any man. She ended up proving something more important, that the best leaders are those who focus on developing others rather than promoting themselves, and that real strength comes from lifting people up rather than tearing them down. The story of the drill sergeant who outshot her unit with a borrowed rifle became legend at Fort Benning. But the real legacy was in the hundreds of soldiers who learned that leadership, courage, and excellence have nothing to do with gender, background, or circumstances, and everything to do with character, determination, and the willingness to serve something greater than yourself.